Hello, everyone. Welcome to the new episode of Sports Across the Pond. This time, we're going to speak about women's sports, and with not just the usuals, me, Carlo De Marchis, Nick Cicero. We have a very welcome speaker, and guest speaker, Nick Mitchell from Sports Pro. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hey, Paola, and hi, everyone. Good to be here with you.
Hello.
So it's great to have you as a guest speaker here with us, Nick, today. The reason why we really wanted to have you, well, it could be to any content, to be honest, because of course you are very much an expert in anything sports and media. But particularly, we wanted to have you here today because the whole topic is about women's sports in seeing in two different versions. One, the business of women's sports. So what do you see there, and what are the trends, and why it really matters right now, because it's getting the momentum. And the second part of the topic that we really would like to understand more about is about women in business. You launched a Sports Pro, the New Era initiative, which is actually super successful. So we definitely would like to know a bit more about that. But let's get it started and let's talk about business. What do you see from your position? Because you've been covering everything in business and lots about women's business, especially lately. What is your view? What is going on?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again for having me. And I think with women's sports, it's in a really interesting time. Obviously, the numbers and the growth that we've seen in consumption and investment from whether it be media rights or sponsors is out of this world if you think about where we were a few years ago. But let's be honest, we were starting at a pretty low baseline. So it's really exciting to see that we're starting to get a lot of momentum, a lot of news coverage, both from trade bodies and publishers like us on deals that are being done, but also by mainstream media covering more about the business side of sports and the women's sports game as well. What I would say on the other side of that is there's still a long way to go even to the general coverage side. I think the numbers are less than 10% of normal media is actually covering women's sports still. But big event moments is really what is really moving the needle in terms of consumption and interest around the women's sports. The Women's World Cup coming up in a few months' time will be a few weeks' time, I should say. It'll be really exciting to see how much impact that has had on a global scale for consumption and interest around women's football, because there's been a lot of progress with what's happening on the Champions League, what's happened in the Euros. Given the challenges with the time zones in Australia and New Zealand, I'm hoping that won't be a barrier for seeing a further kick in interest across the women's football and women's sports completely.
And why do you think it is now? So, because it's clearly it's getting momentum, in the last 12 to 24 months, basically. Everything has happened. So I never heard myself about, it's not never heard, but it wasn't in the news so much. It is now it is a thing, for mainstream. So before it was very much, if you're into it, you know it. Otherwise, you would never even hear about it. What's happening and why?
I mean, my view on it is, you can speculate as to the reasons why we're here and why decisions were being made and not being made. I do think fundamentally there's just more data to support the concept and the reason that, hey, there is a lot of interest in women's sports and women's athletes and all those areas that historically we didn't really have that ease of visibility. You think about YouTube and social media and the role that can play. There's now tangible data that sports properties and investors can look at and go, oh, wow, there's actually a huge engaged audience here. What are we doing to engage with that group? And I also think, in markets like, say, the UK, one of the things that may have helped push the interest in driving women's sports further is the need from a physical perspective and a leisure perspective is to drive more participation in sports. And one of the areas that was underserved was women's sports generally. And so to use women's sports as a catalyst to professionalize it, can use it as a catalyst to potentially drive more interest in participation at grassroots and get people more active, I think was possibly one of the factors that may have been helping at least to see more support coming from a governmental level. But I think data is really a driving part of it. Just some studies that I've seen recently, which are actually going to look to do a bit of a deep dive podcast on this on the Streamtime podcast, which I'm hosting every week. But with Women's Sports Trust, which is a UK-based study, but they saw that around 6 million, there's 6 million committed fans to at least one women's sports property in the UK versus 16 for men. Of those fans, just 3% of those women's fans are fans of only women's sports. So it just shows this general interest in sports. It doesn't have to be male or female. There's just interest in good competition. And the more visibility you get, the more people will be showing interest in and engaging with that content. So look, I think the data is backing everything up. And I think we're only at the starting point of more and more investment coming into this space.
Yeah. Nick, what I think is really interesting that you just mentioned, and I love, I'm a social media guy, so I love that you brought up social media, but it seems to me like that factor of the world that we live in today, the ability for people to kind of gather in communities that are really, really relevant to their passions, they're able to gather and communicate with one another in a lot easier way. So before, you didn't really have as much conversation around women's sports because mainstream media, mass media kind of dominated the conversation with the couple stick and ball sports or a few Olympics coverages here and there that really dominated the bulk of sports. But to your point about the data, I think that's such an interesting point, is where else would we have gone and got the data pre-social media, right? What would we have done? We would have done, extensive surveys and research studies where we'd interview people. We would look at, certain types of empirical data, or you might have to run a years-long study. Whereas now, in just a matter of years, and I know obviously that there's been a lot of groundwork pre-social media to do this, but for example, in the past few years, you get a few influential figures together, like something with the women's soccer league here in the US, for example, with a lot of really influential people behind it. And they start creating a lot of social conversation around it. That also gives you this new pool of data to pull from a lot faster and allows us to enact change a lot faster. I'm just curious to hear what you think about that, or just in general. I know that, being in sports pro, you're kind of seeing how different pockets of different types of women's sports evolve online.
Yeah, I mean, the coverage and the data is backing all that up pretty well. I was actually just thinking, as you're talking about the data side of things, I think one thing that's happened on reflection across more the wider broadcasting space is that we actually start to see, particularly in the UK and other markets, that some of the broadcasters became more selective on what sports they were actually investing in, because they would double down on, well, if we just invest in, so for example, Sky Sports in the UK is an example of this, right? Where they went, okay, they went from a generalist, we're going to have a bunch of different channels covering sports, to we're going to create dedicated single sports channels. The knock-on effect of that is they started putting more money into Formula One and cricket and boxing and so forth, but they reduced their investment in tier 2 and tier 3 sports and just focus on the ones that move the needle and drive subscription growth. And I think now we're just getting to a tipping point now where the interest levels are, at least in terms of having different platforms with more content. Think about fast channels, think about what role YouTube plays, is just providing more opportunity for those tier 2, tier 3 sports to finally get like another chance at mass exposure again. Because let's face it, 10, 20 years ago, if you didn't have the broadcast partnership in place, you were dead in the water in terms of reach and coverage. Now we've sort of gone through almost like a dip, and we're coming back out of it again, where there's now more opportunity than ever for tier 2, tier 3 sports to at least find their own place and destination to build up a serious audience base. And social media is such an important part of that mix. Obviously, social media, in my view, plays in many ways the role of free-to-air TV in terms of mass reach, mass awareness, and discoverability.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I'm kind of leading you into maybe talking a little bit more, but I know that DAZN, for example, somebody that I've worked with quite a bit in my past at Conviva and Del Mondo, they have been somebody who's taken that to the next level in terms of broadcasting things like the women's UEFA championships that are breaking records on YouTube, right?
Yeah, completely. I mean, some of the numbers that they've recently produced a report and shared some figures. I mean, it's important for people that don't quite understand the nuance of that relationship. It's sort of like a tri-point venture between DAZN, the Champions League, and YouTube. But the numbers show, I think they have 50% increase in audiences from year on year. They've seen 57% increase in fan interest, thanks to the availability of it being on YouTube. But what's also really interesting is that commercially, the organization is seeing 54% increase, a 54% more positive impact on revenue to the clubs and teams involved because of the exposure. So they're getting more eyeballs and they're getting more commercial opportunities as a result of that exposure. The challenge for that deal is going to be when DAZN put 2/3 of the live games next season behind a paywall.
Yeah.
What's going to happen there? I get the sense, no one said this to me, but I get the sense DAZN are a little bit nervous about how that's going to go and whether it's actually going to start paying dividends. And I think everyone else is a bit nervous about the knock-on effect of that lack of reach that they've had. But it's a great test bed or a case study for us to see what impact this sort of approach, this sort of journey can have on the women's football game.
One thing that I wanted to say.
Sorry.
So one thing I wanted to say is an aspect of what you said about social. Clearly, broadcast had no data. And I've heard people commenting on how they decide what to put in their fast channel. They use their YouTube audience to understand it. It is quite funny. On the other hand, you know that in music, that could be a setting. If you're not popular on TikTok, they won't produce a record for you. So clearly, different media try to use data from wherever they're relevant. That's the point that I think Nick, sorry, I didn't notice that, we're making. On the other hand, I was intrigued by what Nick Neeson said on subscribers. You know, you focus on verticals because you wanted to have subscriber, but then maybe it's sort of where things now are evolving. It may be because in the early days of the subscriber idea, you had to acquire and convert. As things progress, everybody starts understanding that retention is the real success factor. And retention may mean not only having one or two sports that are super, I would subscribe if they have Formula One. Yeah, but Formula One is once a week, maybe not even every week. So I need something else. And maybe the approach is different because now the quality and that's where you need the data of what you put on top in the bundle of the one or two or three that change the conversion is what may or may not retain people to stay a subscriber, which is clearly, as we go more to profitability, the real number one problem, retaining people, right? I guess.
I think it's funny you mentioned fast. Oh, go ahead, Paola.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add one data because we were talking about the DAZN Women's Champions League, just to give a bit of prospect as well in terms of how big that was. Like I think it was very, like from a growth perspective, all you said, Nick, was very interesting because it's like the numbers are double digit going to triple digit. So it's like, which is not surprising because of course you're starting from a lower point, but still it's massive. The key thing that I was looking at in terms of the numbers there was like that basically their channel in 1 year and a half, that's very young. So they did 100 million views in total. And if you think about Europe as a population, which is 750 million roughly. So they did every person in Europe, 1 out of 7, like basically watched at least a video of the Women's Champions League, just to give a comparison. It's like for something that was not online before, like first time ever, that's the first kind of approach to that, which is basically getting that reach is definitely massive. Of course, then the paywall might be a challenge because you need to invest for a longer period of time to actually get people to get used to it. But interest is there because it could have been very different. It could have been like 1 out of 30 people actually watching it, to be fair. And I think it's surprising 1 out of 7 if you're considering the whole population. So, which is not, of course, it's not the right demographic, but to give a perspective, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just add on that, Paola, that I think one of the big things that this is a reminder of is that there is incredible audience numbers to be produce, not just in women's sports, but indeed just in sports generally, when you open the floodgates and make sure your content is in the right places. The challenge has always been the audiences can be there if we put in the right places. How do you turn that into conversion? How do you monetize that? What will be interesting to see is YouTube has obviously invested a lot of time into creating and maturing their monetization approach around e-commerce, around pay-per-view, the new primetime proposition, and all those extra layers of revenue generation outside of the traditional just subscription offering, which we all know in terms of, in the broadcast space is so hindering to audience growth. It'd be great to see that not only is this able to grow such a scaled audience on YouTube, but indeed they can just turn that directly into serious revenue for both everyone involved. Because what's the magic? What's the tipping point? Like, what numbers do they have to do on YouTube to be able to move the needle enough to generate income? Because it's pretty impressive numbers on the scale, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I've spent the last 35 years in different sports, not only in few sports. And something I noticed through the years, before this moment where clearly we all talk about it, in certain sports, and I think it may be a difference. You mentioned football, soccer, etc. Clearly, these are events that happen completely separate. It's like almost a different game for people, blah, blah, blah. When you're in athletics, at the Olympics, direct experience for me, ski races, ski World Cup, they're together. I learned this from NBC, the broadcaster. It's about a flag, a hero, and a story. Honestly, we would be all mad because now the women's ski team is super strong, or there is an athlete, Fiona May, so honestly, I think this separation between men and women, I understand. I don't condone, but I understand when the sport is completely separate. But very often when the sports are together, I don't see, and tennis is another example with big discussions. So I don't touch tennis, but the other sports, it's about the flag, the hero, and the story. I don't care if it's a man or a woman, and I enjoy sports in the same way. On the other end, you look who's ruling the sports without going to polemic. It's all men. And that, I think, it's a problem in the end. It's definitely a problem.
Well, I guess that's what Nick is doing with the Sports Pro New Era. He's trying to change that, at least to balance that somehow.
Well, we're definitely trying, that's for sure. I mean, one of the things that we've seen, looking at the data ourselves, not only of the audiences that exist, but also the job roles exist, that the industry is so heavily male dominated in terms of percentages, it's pretty hard to, we have a real lack of women in senior positions, although that is changing. If you look around the political world, that you often see that the countries that are run by women are often a little bit less crazy than some of the ones that are run by men. But hopefully that's not a symptom of what you would see in sports moving forward.
I would like just to bring up one more thing when we were talking about business and data. So I was trying to look at numbers of valuations of, especially, I'm following a lot about Alexis Ohanian and what he's doing with Los Angeles Football Club Angel City Football Club. And I was looking at how ambitious that is. Of course, it might not be all of the clubs whatsoever, but basically they started like very recently. And last year they were already valued $100 million, and they're aiming to get to 1 billion in 5 years. Now, of course, let's put in perspective, it might not be 1 billion in 5 years, but still, we are going to basically from 0 to 1 billion as an objective. So just writing it down, it means it's ambitious but achievable. If not in 5 years, it might be done in 10, but still it's something achievable. So going from nowhere to 1 billion, I think that growth rate is very hard to think about in other sports, in other countries. So I think having that opportunity for brands as well to jump in when the the growth is. So getting as well like a good value for and good ROI for the growth, and also for business owners and whoever is investing in the area. I mean, we're talking about massive growth in terms of business. I don't know if you have a view on that, but I was like looking at the numbers. It's like, is that the right number of zeros? It's like, wow.
Well, with Angel City FC, I mean, I'm not as close to the US stuff as perhaps maybe Nick might be, but what I do know is that I think the last reported numbers they had around their sponsorship turnover was about 40 million for the year. So let's assume they might be turning over, on double that across everything else they do. It wouldn't be any more. I mean, it's a pretty lofty valuation number, but the valuation models for American sports properties and sports properties in general in the world are pretty crazy. I mean, what's exciting? Angel City, I do hesitate to look at that example as like a benchmark for the rest of the industry, just because Angel City's framework of the types of people they have involved. Carlo made a point before about storytelling and the personalities and so forth, and that's what sports and the popularity of sports built on. Well, Angel City have a lot of that in terms of the leadership and the whole story from launch and the types of famous people they've had involved from day one, which gives them an incredible platform to bring on partners, drive extra revenue opportunities, broadcast and media coverage that you would just never get anywhere else. I mean, you could think about what's happened with Wrexham, I suppose, in the UK.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it took Ryan Reynolds to get Wrexham a Hulu deal. Same thing. It took Serena Williams and Alexis Ohanian to get an HBO deal, for example, with Angel FC. So sometimes, to your point, it's exactly about that, right? If Wrexham had just got bought by a random billionaire, might have been a totally different story.
Completely. So that's why I'm always a bit hesitant with those stories, because I think they're exceptions rather than the rules, but they do show that there is potential there. Whether they can keep riding that wave of growth, I think a lot of it will depend on how the NWSL's coverage develops and evolves, and they can get some substantial deals there. But they need something to happen more widely to keep the momentum up. But they've got some great people and they're well run. They're an impressive organization, that's for sure.
Yeah, I would just add and I'm cognizant that we're three men and a woman on a show talking about women's sports. So feel free anybody to shut me down. But I do think that when I look at other types of sports out there, I think that you look at maybe football and tennis and golf as some of the most dominant women's sports out there, and I certainly think tennis and golf have quite a bit of mainstream attention. Somebody might prove me otherwise. Obviously, football is one of those global, and then you have the Olympic sports. But then even in the world of men's sports, there's lots of sports that want to be considered the biggest sports in the world that are never going to get there, right? I look at, and this is no offense to them, like a lacrosse, for example. It's a very self-sustaining sport, right? Like they've come out and, they've had a multitude of different types of pro leagues, although I think that, Paul Rabel is doing a pretty good job with the latest version of that. They've expanded to kind of a global game and are really looking to do that. But is men's or women's lacrosse going to be the top billing on an ESPN anytime soon? Most likely not. So I think that there's this, because of the world of choice that we have today, and it's been brought up with the streaming relationships with the social video platforms like YouTube. Last week we talked a lot about the FAST channels, right? We have the demand for content, I would say, on a lot of these places. Like we have a lot of demand for content, but you need to have a demand for unique and differentiated content. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity for women's sports, not looking at the whole industry as a whole, but for different pockets of that, to really fill that niche model as well, to be able to be self-sustaining, to be able to build models that differentiate. And that's the one thing that we do know about the streaming world today, is that everybody wants to differentiate themselves, right? So can YouTube and DAZN and UEFA align together with women's football to really blow that up? Or could there be, somebody like Peacock and what they've done with like a WWE, where they've able to bring that audience over? So I think that what we're going to start to see, and hopefully it can be, monetizable in a great way for everybody involved. But I think there's a really big opportunity with the branded content, with new streaming platforms, and with some level of subscription /free for different types of sport to really expand upon all of that too. I don't know, Nick. The last thing I don't know if you, like I said before, I know I mentioned soccer, football, and golf and tennis. What are some of the other sports that you in particular have seen attracting a lot of attention just in the streaming space, maybe mainstream or niche? I know that you're involved with volleyball. Is volleyball pretty popular? Or there's some other thing? We talk so much about golf and tennis and soccer. I was figured there's probably people out there that are interested in other types of women's sports.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in. I think there's a lot of broad interest across a number of different sports in the same way across men's sports, I think. But in terms of generating the interest on the sort of professional and commercial side, I'd say they're the main ones. I think very interested to see what happens with the WNBA and basketball generally. It feels like that is in such a good place to really take a big step. I know, the coverage has been growing in the US. The coverage of college basketball has been growing in the US exponentially. ESPN's already come out and said they struggle. They're going to struggle to hold on to a lot of their media rights because they have such a sort of not a monopoly, but a bit of a monopoly on the various women's sports they have on the platform. And basketball's probably the core product there. Outside of that, there's some interesting models I'm watching. So volleyball is, as you mentioned, sort of really focused on trying to be very balanced with the amount of coverage and content they produce for both the women's and men's games, both indoor and in beach. I think tennis is one of the ones that's interesting, out with Serena Williams sort of stepping away and so forth. And will there be some shining personalities to come through and heroes to really step up? There's been a lot of great women's players that have sort of popped up, but that's a bit I'm interested also with the investment from CVC coming in. I'm interested to see if that can really spur some action. But I mean, still, football is really the main thing I'll be watching. And also for next year, I'm going to be watching what Paris can bring. What's the Olympics going to bring to the table? Now feels like a great time for some new heroes to be born and to be brought up. And that's a great platform for perhaps some new women's sports, new women's athletes, and potentially even sports to leverage that exposure that Paris might give them.
All right, so I think we still have very few minutes, but I just want to get a bit more of your insights from what you learned from launching the New Era initiative. I think I want to make sure that we go through it because I was happily surprised when I saw like full house, no place to sit when at the event there in London for the Sports Pro Live. And actually I couldn't get into the second event. It was too many people. And I was like, oh my God, there's something going on here. So, I was very happy to see. So what's your learning there? What do you see there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we launched the New Era program as an initiative. We spurred out of a bit of frustration, I think, for us. Like what we were really seeing is, we run events, we do media content, and we were really struggling to really get quite a breadth of female voices on and in our content, and also just the lack of diversity at our events. So we thought, let's try and see if we can just do something that might help a little bit in that space and maybe open up some opportunities for some other female leaders in the industry or female executives. So we launched the New Era program, which the concept was to build a class of I think it was 13 or 14 women who would have the opportunity to get mentorship from real senior leaders in the industry. We're talking let's say like Alexandra Willis, the Director of Digital at Premier League. We're talking Johanna Ferries, the SVP of Activision Blizzard, Commercial Director of ATP Media, CFO, COO of English Rugby Union, Charlotte Burr from FIFA, and about a bunch of others that are real quite senior C-level executives, and they would become effectively mentors for this class. But what we didn't expect was the popularity and interest. We had something like, I think it was like 270 women applied to be in the program. And we were expecting not even a fraction of that number. And we only marketed it through very much a very simple marketing campaign through our own channels. But so we tailored that group and we looked at all these people that engaged with them on the first wave and went, wow, we need to do something more. So we've launched podcast series, articles, webinars, and are producing a whole stream of content to talk to this audience set itself. So it's not about creating awareness of women in the sports industry, but it's actually to help create a community of women in the sports industry and also tell their stories and heighten awareness of the role models that exist in this industry and space that are the female leaders. And fast forward sort of 9-12 months as this has been growing, we've got something like 33 different countries represented in our community. The people who've signed up to be part of the community and the different content initiatives we do is approaching 1,000 people. We had 200 attend our event in Sports Pro Live. 200 apply to attend. We had to limit the numbers because we couldn't fit them all in the room, as you pointed out before. And we're really excited. Like, there's such an incredible interest. And if you talk to the people that are involved, it's so refreshing to hear that actually that they love it. They love being involved with it. They love the ability to engage with their peers and people in a similar boat and a similar experience. And there's huge support developing around it, both also from men within the industry who really want to empower and support women in the industry, because there's still quite a dearth of women in this sector. Now, sports has still a huge problem, top down and bottom up, right? There's not enough women who are interested in getting into the sports industry. Like, there's a lack of supply because sports is not a particularly attractive place for some women to come into on first instance. And there's still a lack of leadership in those top roles that we need to see have more role models. But we're hoping to see that we are seeing that is changing. And we want to just really foster that continues to progress, and we start seeing more women interested in the industry and taking roles in the industry at all levels, not just at the top or at the bottom. So we're hoping to play a little bit of a role in that, because we think it's a really important part of helping this industry progress.
Well, that's great to see. To be honest, I was happily surprised, and I'm really curious to see what's going to be in a year from now, because as you see, it's growing like massively, and that's nice to see.
Just wanted to add one thing about, I think Nick was saying, Nick Cicero was saying, we're 3 men and 1 woman. So it's very delicate, a bit sophisticated argument, but yes, it may be bad for representation in this case. But the fact that men are involved in progressing, women in the sport business, women in sport, is crucial, not only because at least they're 50%, even if we know in some cases are 80% and in the top 80% position, but it's crucial. And more I see this kind of, diversity chat where someone on the underrepresented group says, yeah, but you created the problem, solve the problem. I have a friend that is an exec in a top broadcaster, and she says, I'm always invited to this panel. Just do something. Don't stop inviting me to panel. Let me work. Yeah. But do something. Take action.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then, I've had the pleasure of sitting with a lot of the fine women that Nick mentioned, like Alex Willis and others on panels. And, honestly, all of my best clients and employees and people that I've worked with my life in the social video world have been really smart women. So yeah, obviously looks are one thing, but I know that everybody here on this call is always driving to figure out ways that we can achieve equality and representation. So, it's kind of hard to not mention it though, tongue in cheek.
Well, we have as well, like Alfonso saying that it's great initiative. So we have support from Mexico. So I think the time is running up. So thank you very much, Nick, for being with us. Thanks, Nick Cicero as well, and Carlo De Marquis. And
ciao from London.
3 from London and 1 from the US. Now it's we're forgetting about mainland Europe right now. So thank you again, and see you in 15 days for the next episode of Sports Across the Pond. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Ciao.
Everyone.